Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you. Welcome to this episode of the IPSA seminar series brought to you by the International Peace College, South Africa, and I am Ihsaan Taliep. With us this evening, we are very honored to be joined by one of our panelists who participated in this seminar process by the name of Dr. Anwar Nagia. Dr. Anwar Nagia is someone I believe needs no introduction in the city of Cape Town. He's a person whose life had been devoted to social justice, a very renowned personality and figure within the anti-apartheid struggle, known really for his social justice activism. Dr. Anwar Nagia does, however, carry many other caps in terms of financial development, also within the field of ethics and social justice, I may add, being the head of Element Investment and many other portfolios. I am very, very honored and happy to introduce to you this evening Dr. Anwar Nagia. Dr. Anwar Nagia, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome and thank you very, very much for honoring our invitation.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's indeed an honor and a privilege absolutely to be here and also to partake in probably the most vexed question globally, and of course the insistence that IPSA as an institution of knowledge production has allowed this particular debate to take place. I think it was quite fortuitous that the institution has undertaken such a dynamic program, but more so to clarify and to give direction to many scholars, students, as well as civil society, on clarifying some of the positions around the topic at hand. So yes, I commend you for that service.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anwar. Of course, in that particular context, the presentation of these topical issues, Dr. Anwar, in our particular institutional ethos framework is one which really wants to advance the principles of the Quranic value of wasatiyya, the God ordained definition or description rather to the ummah of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of wasatiyya, described as the justly balanced ummah. So in dealing with this particular concept, as well as we have done previously in many of these fora, is to really view these issues in a very balanced way and try to obviously go beyond the hype that is created in the media with media sound bites, but to go down and look at more of the underlying causes and structural sort of bases for the phenomena that we are viewing as human society in the globe, but more particularly ourselves here in South Africa as well. And so from the perspective of the notion of caliphate, as we have been discussing, we obviously want to have good understanding about what, from the Islamic perspective in particular, this concept really entails. And then this is obviously in line with the principle of wasatiyya, juxtaposed to the question of also viewing and understanding what are the sort of circumstances that are at play in terms of the geopolitical complexities that really besiege the Muslim world in particular in this day and age. And we have of course had some wonderful contributors to this program. We had the very acclaimed Islamic legal scholar Professor Jasir Ouda that spoke about what is Islamic law. And then he spoke about what is the Islamic State, what is an Islamic State. And obviously from his perspective, as is the case with Islamic law, is that an Islamic State is one which is really based on values and on principles of ethics, and that it's not a law so-called formalistic based structure, but a value-based structure and a model-based structure. And he of course referenced the very important Maqasid al-Sharia. Incidentally, Dr. Jasir is obviously also currently involved at IPSA with this Shatibi Chair of Maqasid Studies. And so obviously we've really focused on this area in itself. And he was focusing on the whole notion of preservation of faith, for example, as being one of the ultimate values and purposes, higher purposes of Islam. So if an Islamic state does not advance and advocate and preserve freedom of conscience and the right to the freedom of conscience. It cannot be in any imagination be said to be an Islamic state, because these are principal Islamic values. La ikraha fi Deen is just a clarion call. And of course these are all values which in our context here, Dr. Anwar, is very akin to our constitutional sort of context here in South Africa, which all have in the Bill of Rights these values that we all enjoy the benefits thereof. And so that was brilliant, I think, in that sense. We also had our own Dr. Abdul Karim Tofa reflecting on the values of the maqasid being really one which calls for a contextual application of Islamic law, and that it is impossible to view Islamic law application within a context of a previous 700 years compared to a following 700 years and think that there would be a fit. That's impossible. Context change, human societies change, structures change, as we obviously are discussing today. And so we also had the wonderful input of our brother Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, who spoke about his interregnum notion that we're sitting perhaps, perhaps on a positive footing as well. From the Quranic perspective, he says that the notion of fath or victory is a complex one. And he believes that this low ebb that we're currently experiencing in the Muslim world is really the time and the space for us to begin to reimagine ourselves as an ummah, to reinvent, so to speak, and to reconfigure our notions. He particularly said we need to focus and give attention to these fault lines of Sunni Shi'i. How do we imagine this, and how is this contributing to the sad state of affairs that we find ourselves in? He spoke about the Islamist, so-called secularist divide as well, and we find this obviously abundantly relevant and applicable in the Muslim context, in the Muslim world. And then our good brother Professor Aslam Fattar gave his input in terms of how the nation state per se is something probably that we need to evaluate and critically analyze, because this hasn't brought security and safety and peace for all, as can be seen in local contexts, as can be seen in those contexts internationally, but that rather we should look at what are these underlying systems and structures that have given rise to these levels of inequality, these levels of poverty within a society, and that have obviously brought about major levels of unsettlement, major levels of disparities in society. Dr. Anwar, let me ask you just for your quick reflections and thoughts on the conference that we've had in general, and your thoughts in that regard, and maybe we can then go into some of the more specific points that we've had.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Shukran for engaging me on this program, and I've looked at the topic not with fascination but with concern. And I think all conscious and civilized human beings will be conspicuous in their silence and in their absence if they do not engage in this debate. So the conference for me was an illumination of something that I always anticipated needed to be done. The structure of the conference itself, addressing the critical issues from where we are as not only as Muslims, but where we are as human beings, is a valuable contribution. Now, all of the speakers, one after each other, articulated different positions which regards the global relevancy of a social order that can transcend what the contradictions are, and particularly Islam as a discourse and as a way of life and not as a religion was almost to an extent vindicated every single day. And both Quran speaks about the non-compulsion in religion itself, speaks to the tolerance, the high tension and the high ability to absolutely make that position, not from any arrogance, but just saying there's no compulsion in religion, allowing other thought processes to take place. But what Islam offers, and the conference have brought that out in terms particularly on what an Islamic state should be, in terms of all of its manifestations, both economically, religiously, issues of history, issues of science and contribution. The Islamic social system, as articulated by Professor Jasri, in fact reminded me and vindicated my thought patterns that it can contribute to what the global discourse is going through now. The issues particularly of the rise of nationalism in Europe is informed on a post-Cold War basis. So we're seeing the rise of nationalism not against the bogies which the West have created between the West and of course the kind of communist world or the Soviet Union. Post the Cold War period, a new kind of debate had to occupy the minds of certain of the proponents of the discourse, the disruption in the discourse now. So it's formed by greed, by capitalism. It's not necessarily informed by the rise of nationalism, because I think that is as an implanted thing. Racism has come to its fore, manufactured to an extent, because 700 years and the contemporary period now, we actually saw racism to an extent abate. It wasn't, people had the ability to coexist. And of course this was introduced again as a new phenomenon to project and to propel this particular thought pattern. It's also, we cannot believe that it's not informed by finance. We cannot believe that the geopolitics where the issues of this discourse started in the Middle East was not informed by warmongers and what we call fire worshippers. I mean, you know, the West literally, to me, is predominantly fire worshippers. So it's because they believe in arms, they believe in fire, they believe in nuclear, and these are all sales. These are commoditizing their businesses. And how do they fuel their businesses? They fuel their businesses by instability. They fuel their businesses by wars. They fuel their businesses then by deliberately, all of a sudden, using religious issues as a way to manifest itself, and of course giving people the notion of so-called freedom and so-called independence from states itself that were closed and was manufactured by them. So it's really a mixed bag, and for Muslim scholars and for thinkers to articulate Islamic expression, it's evident, not arrogantly, it's evident that we had precedent for all of these social conditions that in fact keep societies back within the Islamic concepts. And if we're saying it the way we are saying it, it would seem that we're arrogant. And so therefore, the whole notion of ISIS, the whole notion of Daesh, the whole notion of the destabilization is to present Islam in a way in the minds of a captive audience that will mitigate the Islam that we're talking about. The Islam that we speak about, that has this notion of justice, of fairness, that speaks to the environment, that speaks to the economics, that speaks to movement of thought, of free thought, of free expression. So because of that threat, there's these different agendas. Now I know I'm kind of all over the show, but I want to plant a canvas that you can understand why there is such confusing things. Where do you attack this octopus? I mean, it's got 8 or 9 legs. It's so difficult. And therefore the conference, in fact, bring it all down to one kind of focus, is to say, how do we intervene in the spaces? But we have to answer the question of the rise of perceived Shiism or Sunnism. We have to answer the question of Wahhabism. We have to answer the question of the nation state. We have to answer the question, the formation of the post the Ottoman period, the engineered collapse of the Ottoman period, the engineered collapse of the Caliphate, and why there was a consensus in almost all of those territories, and probably parts of Eastern and Western Europe, you know, where for centuries there was a relative peace under the Ottoman discourse at the time, and why it was necessary. So it is very difficult for Muslim scholars. Well, it's not difficult for us, but it's difficult for people to understand the role of what IPSA was trying to do with the conference. Assemble great minds together and absolutely try to just stabilize the thought patterns and bring us back onto that patterns. So that's my maybe initial take, and why the conference was important, and why we can't underestimate the impact, and why that must be encouraged. then this whole notion of what is called the radical middle way. It's a new phenomena to some people, but it's an old phenomena to Islam. Our Prophet ﷺ always speaks about moderation in any approach, you know, and taking that thesis of moderation and extrapolating it in every aspect of our life, you can almost understand the sense. You can almost understand the dignity of moderation, as opposed to the extremities in both ends. Moderation cannot be confused by sitting on a fence. Moderation cannot be confused by not taking a side. Moderation takes a side. It takes a fundamental side. It takes the heat and it takes the cold of both extremities and absolutely give it an expression that is fair to humanity and it's fair to the coexistence of man. And that's the depth of the kind of radical middle way that must be pushed now. That's the emphasis that we have to push going forward, with not making apologies. Now, because it's confused with the intervention of powerful media houses, very, very powerful media, who cannot serve this agenda, who have no interest in serving this agenda. You know, on the one hand, it's supposed to be free journalism. On the other hand, it is supposed to be giving expression to different media houses that want to push a particular line. Everything is not necessarily conspiratorial, but it's down to economics. Some of the underpinning of the global insurrection and the global discourse on markets and stock markets have found its way in deep-rooted long-wave recessions, economic recessions, both in Europe. From the 1929 collapse of what is called the modern stock markets in the US, and the kind of free world in free market conditions under a quasi-capitalist state, and in both in Britain, in America, and in Europe, they believe in what is called a hybrid state. It's a social welfare state. I mean, people for generations are still living on the dole. They've never worked in their life. They worked from the client states. They get their money from Africa. They get their money from states which they exploit, and they can subsidize their workers. So all of those are within the agenda. But I think the exciting thing for me, the very, very exciting thing for me in this 21st or 22nd century, is that there is a large amount of people that are becoming quite vigilant to wanting just a peaceful coexistence. There's more of that. I'm not convinced that the prophets of doom is gaining ground on us. The intelligence and the conversions to logic and peace is more, it outweighs. It's just exaggerated by these media houses. So I'm concerned, but I'm not too concerned.
Dr. Anwar,
that's just my take on it.
That is a profound sort of closing point that you had there, because if one considers again this whole notion of the middle path, obviously it requires of you to be able to really identify and understand and recognize these extremities that are at play. And today, for example, we find that there's quite a number of authorship publications and productions that look, for example, in the Muslim world, and I guess it applies everywhere, but more particularly in the Muslim world today, where there's this notion of tyranny from a political perspective, but juxtaposed once again by tyranny from a religious perspective. And so religious tyranny and political tyranny seem to be the kind of bedfellows in the Muslim world that seeks to really maintain the status quo. And that status quo finds also its oxygen really from a perpetuation of people's state of lack of education, lack of understanding, and obviously that is further perpetuated by situations and conditions of poverty and depravity, etc., in terms of people being deprived of normal daily livelihoods. And so again, this notion of understanding from the middle path, and understanding from a question not only of what is middle, but also that which is most just. Dr. Anwar, the issue obviously finds, I think, relevance for ourselves here in a local context as well. I think Professor Aslam Fattar, when he referenced, the necessity for us to look at these structural sort of phenomena of the era, the so-called New World Order that we're living in. These things find manifestation within our own context here as well, and the sooner we are able to really make sense and be active participants for change within our own context, the sooner we will be able to make an impact beyond our own context and beyond our borders. Dr. Anwar, the need for us to also, from a local perspective, like he is saying, give reflection or give analysis to how these conditions contribute to these phenomena of extremism in the world, the phenomena of the perpetuation of political tyranny and injustice. How should we be reflecting on that from a South African sort of specific perspective as well?
Look, I think it's something post-94, and we have to go back to post-94, because before 94 you could find reasons and rationale for why that kind of thought and thinking was not on the agenda, because we were busy with the struggle, an anti-colonial struggle. We were struggling for a democracy in this country. But you had a sense of intense learning and leadership pre-94. I find it very, very difficult in the post-apartheid period that the dynamism of the leaders, there seemed to be a vacuum. It's a concern that youth manifests itself in a way that there is no spiritual leadership. Now, it might be a controversial point. I'm not saying spiritual leadership that both our ulama, our mosques and our churches and our institutions of spiritual guidance is not there. Of course, they're doing their work, and they've done a sterling work uninterrupted for many centuries in this country, and we respect them. But I find that there is a discourse of ignorance that is taking place, and it's coupled by the economic disposition of people. You're right, poverty is a violent form of existence, and people are not necessarily preoccupied by articulating global discourses and think patterns and thought patterns for South Africa, because it's best left for institutions. That's where you find your education, at universities and at schools. That's where you find your religious education, in mosques and churches and stuff like that. These kind of things have almost been identified as the kind of panaceas for those kind of solutions. I think what IPSA has done is to reintroduce the notion of thought leaders, and also the notion of bringing this debate to the fore across a wide spectrum of people. And I think that is needed more. Colloquiums, discussions, lectures, all of those things to determine exactly the direction that we want people to go in. And we lack that. It's a problem. I find that when I speak to students, they are preoccupied, yes, with fees, yes, with getting their education, but not ideological. There's nothing, they are not prefacing their discussions with me in saying, this is my ideological position. They're not saying that.
There's no higher purpose.
That's right. That's right. All they're saying is, how do I exist? How do I survive this period? How do I make ends meet? How do you know? Yes. But they're not saying, how do we intervene ideologically? I want people to take a position. Even if the position is wrong, they must take a position. I tell every student and I tell every leader, take a position. Fine, because we can always debate why a position is wrong, and if you're bright and intelligent scholar, you will then accept
the critique that comes
with it. Yeah. But take a position, and I find that nobody takes a position. Yeah. Nobody is actually arguing with me or with you from any context. Yeah. You must argue from a context, and if you can't argue from a context, there can be no resolution. Now, I want to introduce that all of our leaders and all of our people that can intervene in the space give people this kind of message, that when you're speaking or arguing, and I got a sheikh at the Azavia Mosque that says, if you come to me, Anwar, please bring your dalil. You know, bring your, I'm not going to speak to you. I'm not going to argue. Bring your sources and bring your thing. Otherwise, we're going nowhere. And I think that penny dropped with me all the time. So A, you must have a context. B, you must try and be relevant. And C, what you're doing is absolutely morally and socially right in trying to create a better space and a better living for people. Not to kind of camouflage it with just human survival. Now we have this acute nature in South Africa. You have the contradictions between capital and labor, which is intensifying. So you have apartheid on the back burner, and ironically, those people who fought apartheid, I think they were structurally wrong. You had to fight an anti-colonial struggle and a class struggle. The struggle ultimately for me was a class struggle, not an anti-apartheid struggle, because the anti-apartheid struggle was only a manifestation of the way we were oppressed. Because now apartheid is gone and they're still poor.
The same old same. They're still the same.
So if you fought a class struggle, yes, at least you can elevate the working class to even to the middle, and then bring them up. So it is difficult. So you're stuck in the middle where people were fed on an anti-apartheid struggle and not a class struggle.
Dr. Anwar, at that point we have to leave it. I think it's very fortuitous once again that we are almost bringing this symposia to discussions that we've had to a close, and almost prefacing it for our next level of discussions, which is the following symposium that we had on Islamic civilization. And the main issues that also arose there was particularly how, for example, even when we claim to be promoting Islam, and when we claim to be coming to the aid of the deprived and those who are downtrodden of society, that we even have and we display sometimes attitudes that could be viewed or perceived to be akin even to chauvinism, racism, etc., etc. And so that's also, I think you're kind of directing us into our next series of discussions, Dr. Anwar. I'll be happy once again to call upon you to continue with that discussion and the discourse. Dr. Anwar, thank you very, very much for joining us on this episode. Your insights and your discussion of the context is really much appreciated. Thank you very, very much.
Shukran very much. I really appreciate it, and inshallah, I'll be glad to participate. And once again, IPSA, great job done. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa
barakatuh. And to our viewers, that brings us to the end of this episode. We hope that you will be able to join us again shortly. Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you.